So the net zero policies hang like a sword of Damocles over the head of the UK's citizens. As Western economies have rocked on the precipice of recession, politicians are weighing up the optics as to what is the best thing to sacrifice: the comfort of their citizens, their children, their cars, their homes, and their crazy green dreams of a Crystal Palace utopia. They're sort of kept telling their constituents to sacrifice all they love to save the planet. But has this produced an entirely avoidable problem of energy scarcity? And as a result, has it produced some net zero skepticism in the formerly very teal Tory party? Speaking of coming storms, if you'd like to go over to lotuseaters.com, Rory has just put up an article about the political miasma that we're all experiencing at the moment. There's something in the air, definitely. We can all feel that after Trump's FBI raid and the sort of winter of discontent 2.0 we're staring down, there's definitely some sort of civil strife coming, and hopefully we can avoid it, but he's preemanating that people of different political persuasions are definitely getting agitated about something, and let's hope it doesn't come to a violent head. So, first off, the UK is looking at a massive spike in its energy bills. Now, this might be esoteric for some of our overseas viewers, but we'll explain the policies as we go. We have an energy price cap over here. It's an arms race between energy suppliers and the government. They've set a certain rate at which the energy prices can't go above, and every time that global gas suppliers, for example, take a massive price hike and the energy suppliers have to produce at a net loss, the government decides to hike our bills all at once. And it's been going up pretty increasingly over the last few years. Have you been hit hard by this particular thing? Or?
I actually haven't, because I live alone in a new build flat that's incredibly hot. I mean, it's like basically 28 degrees in there all the time at the moment, and it's insane. So I looked at my heating bill, and it's the same. It's a new build, so it's all one bill. You know, it's electric, and it's just the same as far as I can see. So I have not been, but people with families and normal, healthy lives are hit very hard by this.
Yeah, you're basically living in the equivalent of Elizabeth Bathory's crypt, of where they've bricked you up behind a wall with one gap just for your degenerate crimes. So the energy price cap, which is in effect in England, Scotland, and Wales, going up in October. The energy and industry analysts, Cornwall Insight, predict an average bill will reach £3,582 a year. That's £200 higher than the previous estimate. In January 2023, the next time the cap is due to be changed, because, of course, energy prices keep going up and they have to be adjusted, it expects to go up to £4,266 for the average family. This is insane. So that means £355 a month for the average household instead of the £164 a month current average. Just to add an extra sting into your wallet, the average bill was £1,400 a month in October 2021. So that's nearly a £3,000 increase. This has obviously been blamed on Putin's price hike, as Joe Biden would say. The actual issue is that the UK, sorry about this, the TV might go off otherwise, the UK have sabotaged their energy independence by selling off all our shale gas, by planting tons of windmills and solar panels all across our green landscape, and failing to invest in nuclear power. So isn't that just wonderful? Anyway, next, the UK is bracing for blackouts, according to Bloomberg, and we've actually got a heads up about this from a viewer who sent a tip in a few days ago. I believe it was on Monday, saying materials have been circulated around the national grid, briefing people that work there to prepare for this kind of energy outage. I also spoke to a nuclear engineer who's on staff that provided me some insights, and some of the things he said. Currently, the national grid undervalues the role of grid inertia and stabilization. That's where kinetic energy is produced when you're generating forms of energy, and that ends up stabilizing the rate at which energy goes out and prevents it from doing outages. If there's not enough grid inertia, then you can get a dip in generation, and boom, regionally it goes out. And the national grid isn't one big interconnected web. It has loads of subgrids, and if one of those goes down pretty instantly, they'll try and make up the shortfall in another. And if they can't do that, the other one will go down and be a massive blackout across the network. Problem is, something like renewables has basically zero grid inertia. So that means if the renewables have a generation dip because the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, the whole grid can go out. And they did this it was somewhere in the southwest a couple of years ago, and it was pretty catastrophic. And the problem is they've got an automated system to do the shutdown, but then to get it back online, obviously the generators have got to warm up, it takes time. So it can go out in a matter of seconds, but it can take hours or days to get back. And so if you've got no backup generators, and if you've got no instantly dispatchable tech like nuclear or gas, you're up S Creek.
Just reminds me of what Jordan Peterson always says about the infrastructure. It's a miracle any of this works. And he starts crying because it's like, we have this complicated infrastructure held up by working men, that nobody cares about.
Come on.
Yeah, and it's a miracle. And he's right. When you start to mess with it, we start dicking around with stuff like lockdowns or stuff we're doing now, you just go, stop it.
Yeah.
This is a delicate infrastructure.
One of the recent quotes he had in a Q&A with a Canadian comedian, he said, we're getting to the point now where, because diversity quotas and anti-meritocracy has infected everything, the bridges will start collapsing and it will still be blamed on a lack of authentic black voices. And isn't that the depressing truth? So, in this article it says, under the government's latest reasonable worst-case scenario, Britain could face an electricity capacity shortfall totaling about 1/6 of peak demand. Cling on to that figure of about 1/5 to 1/6, even after emergency coal plants are fired up. Under that outlook, below average temperatures and reduced electricity imports from Norway and France could expose 4 days in January when the UK may need to trigger emergency measures to conserve gas. So notice how they're saying they're not going to try and increase supply here. They don't conceive of a way that could stop them from sabotaging our energy independence with bad policy. Instead, they're going to constrict your usage. And a little while ago, as I covered with Carl when we were talking about Uber, they're investigating how, if we're all switching to electric cars and smart meters, they can turn off our electric car charging port remotely from the government at peak hours. So it's basically a travel lockdown. And if you charge your electric car and leave it in your driveway, then the national grid can drain your car battery or all of those of your household appliances back if the grid has a dip. So it can just turn off all your power and shut you down and make sure you can't go anywhere at a moment's whim. Just because their energy policies are so bad, they can't meet demand. It's insane.
Well, I mean, it might be too big a question to just throw in here, but are they that bad or is it deliberate? That's the question that I always wonder, because it makes you so angry because it's so unnecessary. And then you start to think, but is it this? There was a clip of Gordon Brown, who seems to have popped up lately, going around the internet, where he's talking about the fourth industrial revolution and Klaus Schwab, of course.
Like 2004.
Yeah, and isn't it just how to deal with the obsolescence of most of the workforce, which is coming due to robotics and AI as they see it? And it's like Schwab and co. trying to get us used to the most basic possible living standards that will cost them the least money. Or is it sheer incompetence?
I don't think it's sheer incompetence, because when I was in the policy sphere and marketing this, and we'll come onto my modelling very shortly for exactly what kind of stuff this has happened in terms of going full renewable and why it won't work. You can't tell me that one idiot from his bedroom can model this with the help of a couple of industry experts down the phone versus hundreds of people in Whitehall who are making these policies. Nobody's thought about, for example, when you import loads of Australian trees to rewild the landscape, how this might cause a forest fire. There was no forest fire provisions in the National Tree Strategy. There was no blackout provisions in their energy strategy. There was no electric car charging port expansion problems in the cities in their transport ban for 2030. All of these oversights just conveniently immiserate us. And I do think, as a bitter cynic, it's got to the point where you can't do Hanlon's razor of saying, oh, it's just incompetence. I think there's too much, especially when they put it on their own website, too much of a coordinated effort to make us live in the dark, live in the pod, eat the bugs. So the power cuts would come even as Britons face up to average energy bills rising above £4,200, as we already covered. The first stage of the UK's emergency plan involves the network operator directing the flow of gas into the system, temporarily overriding commercial agreements. And the person that said all this has been asked to be anonymised, of course. The second stage involves halting supplies to gas-fired power stations, triggering planned power cuts for industry and domestic users. So they're planning power cuts in specific areas, so they don't think that your life and industry are essential. Remember the term essential workers and under lockdown? Well, they're doing it now with energy rationing. Life could get more difficult for Britain if the supply of electricity is curtailed along huge cables connecting to France, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Norway said on Monday. It's looking at ways to limit power exports in winter to prevent domestic shortages. And this is because particularly Europe, has gotten hooked on Russian gas, and that's why in Belgium the EU is saying to their residents, please turn your lights off when you leave the room, because basically gas is at a wholesale spike of like 500%, because they relied on Nord Stream 2 and paid more into that than NATO, and so they've made the noose for their own neck, and because we're on global gas supplies rather than exploiting things like the North Sea or fracking the last how many years, or building nuclear power when Gordon Brown could have, for example, as you mentioned, we're now at the behest of them because we're idiots. So, if we look at the next one as well, this coincides with a drought. So the hosepipe ban, so a bunch of water companies, including Thames Water, around where I live in Kent, mean that they're going to be shutting off the hosepipes. And we're basically going back to 1976 when we had that massive drought where we were both too young for this. But there was a plague of ladybirds. It was record heat wave. They actually reference it in this article. And everyone had hosepipe and tap bans to the point where you'd have to go to a spigot in the middle of the street and share water around each other like it's some sort of children in need advert.
Wow, I do remember hosepipe bans even in the 80s, but yeah, I don't go quite back to 76.
No. So yeah, it's quite third world. Millions of more households could face hosepipe bans after the driest July in decades, as forecasters warn of another heat wave, and we're sort of feeling it right now. It's a bit miserable, but it's not that bad. Temperatures are predicted to rise above 30 degrees centigrade next week, so that'd be this week, with little respite this month for communities on the verge of drought. Southeast Water became the second supplier to introduce a hosepipe and sprinkler ban. It announced restrictions on about 2.2 million customers in Kent and Sussex from a week on Friday, until further notice. This means that hosepipes cannot be used to water gardens or clean cars, and ornamental ponds and swimming pools must not be filled. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no one talks about the ornamental ponds.
No.
So I'm glad we're finally addressing that.
Yeah,
on Lotus
essential
Eaters.
goods. Well, but this is the insane thing. I guarantee I know what's caused this. It's not like we're the Californians of where we have no access to water. I mean, we are an archipelago full of rain after all. The main issue is, I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the history podcast
Dominion
guy.
Hang on, have I said the wrong thing? Didn't he write that book?
He might have done.
Okay.
But yeah, he's a history podcast fellow. So he went to a Conservative Environment Network conference, of which he was the most conservative person there. And it was hilarious because he was quoting Scruton and nobody else were, including the Conservative MPs, by the way. And he said, my village in like Stratford, out in the backside of nowhere, has no water flowing through its rivers because all of the water has been redirected by Thames Water to central London because the population density in London has increased massively, but the sewage system hasn't been updated since the Victorian era. So we're so overburdened that our sewage is overflowing, the Thames is being polluted, and we can't get enough water for the central city populations. So I guarantee this is because of mass migration. 100%. This is a trickle-down effect of the fact that our infrastructure cannot keep up with the amount of people that need to use it.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, he wrote Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Same guy, right?
Yes, yeah, that would be him.
Go.
Yeah.
I knew something Connor didn't for once, guys.
There we go. Well, yeah, I haven't read that one, unfortunately, but it actually sounds up my street. So, despite all of these costly implications, should we drive ahead with renewables anyway? This is an article that I did quite a while ago that comes hot off the heels of a paper I did in which I modelled the effects of renewables on the economy. And I'm just going to go through some of the stats here. So, a fully renewable grid would produce only about 26.5% of Britain's entire existing energy supply. Now, that's not counting for the fact that everything's going to be increased because of electric cars, everyone's working from home, etc. And so that sort of 1/6 demand number looks quite similar to that. Of course, we're not reaching a fully renewable grid, but we're seeing the sort of trend of as the renewables increase, our energy scarcity problem worsens. It would have no protection from blackouts because it's very weather dependent and has no grid inertia. It would cost the UK, before inflation, mind you, I calculate this number, £2.9 trillion. That's more than the annual GDP. That would also take minerals we don't have, so that's 80% of battery manufacturing capacity every year is made by China. So we'd have to go cap in hand to them, right as we're in a new Cold War against them. And they've got the Belt and Road Initiative of 140 countries, which captures most of the mineral deposits in places like Afghanistan that we just handed over to them, and Argentina. So it takes minerals we don't have unless we go into outer space, and it would take the world's entire battery manufacturing capacity to stop from electric cars and renewables just to go straight to England until 2030. So that's not a very feasible plan, is it? Yet we're driving straight ahead with it.
Yeah, well, a lot of that stuff is like that. I mean, and this 2030 stuff, we talked about whether it's sinister, but or is it a lot of it just the mad ideology of the current parties? We'll get onto that later, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's a sort of goal-setting mentality of we have to have a deadline, we have to have a date, causality and practicality be damned. Because some of it's electoral promises, but some of it, especially with the think tanks like the WEF and the UN, they're setting a hardline date of when their new regime will be instantiated. And so if people go, but it doesn't work, it doesn't matter if it doesn't work for us. It certainly works for them. Because they can make promises and they can say, "Oh, here's the date where we'll be toasting to the new utopia." So I hear the types like the Conservative Environment Network crying, saying, "Wind is cheap." Okay, so if we were to go for wind and solar, the grid capacity would nearly quadruple. They would have to nearly quadruple to facilitate the switch from 40 gigawatts to 154.6 gigawatts. And if wind and solar were to double their grid contributions, the cost for consumers would increase £10 for every single megawatt hour generated. Then the production price for wind and solar have decreased from between about 70 to 90% since 2009. The cost of generation is actually competitive with natural gas, coal, and nuclear. But the reason is it's been subsidised to the tune of £9 billion every year. £350 per household. And that's because, and this is what Liz Truss is pledging to cut, 23% of energy bills in the UK are subsidies for the renewables industry. So we could, right now in the middle of this energy crisis, just slash nearly a quarter of our energy bills, but we don't. She's promising that. Sunak decidedly is not, and we'll get onto the crimes of Sunak in the later segment. But the frustrating thing is, why don't we learn from Germany? Because Germany attempted this, of course, after the Fukushima disaster. Angela Merkel, who should have known better because she's a physicist, decided to decommission all of Germany's nuclear power plants by 2022, go fully renewable. And a lot of this was funded by, for example, I know they've just appointed their new climate czar as the head of Greenpeace. They haven't learned their lesson, but loads of the green activists were actually funded by Russian oligarchs and Gazprom. I think it's about 25% of all activity in a lot of these countries was funded by Gazprom to then get them hooked on on gas rather. But they got rid of all their nuclear plants and tried to go fully renewable. And immediately when they did, they couldn't generate enough energy because they had no storage, and they had rolling blackouts across Berlin. China just did the same thing. They had rolling blackouts trying to go fully renewable. So now they've opened 252 new coal-fired power plants, and they're going to emit the equivalent of 16% more in terms of global emissions by 2030, when we're only 1%. It's suicidal.
And that's why
work.
Trump sent Merkel a white flag of surrender, which I think was just a napkin at a dinner party, but he was saying to her, "You've surrendered to the Russians."
Yeah. It's a typically French trait, but it applies to our continental brethren all over, it seems, at the moment. So it seems like net zero promises are encountering something called economic reality, and they're being slowly rescinded. If we go to the next piece, it's Tory party members won't care about net zero targets because 90% will be dead by 2050. And this comes from Chris Skidmore, the man who signed it into law. This was the man who sat with me on a panel at Conservative Party conference that I was invited to speak at. And when asked, how did you do the 2050 target for net zero? How did you bring the number down? He went, I just changed it. So it didn't cost it at all. And when I asked him that, he just sort of looked blank. It looked like I just killed his child in front of him because he's so wedded to this goal. And he actually says, speaking on a panel organised by the National Grid, he says, of course, most candidates would say that because when you cast the question as net zero 2050, probably 90% of them will be dead. Steve Baker, MP for Wickham, who's one of the more libertarian ones, sort of, he had a profile on the Wef's website, so I don't trust him, said, everyone cares deeply about their children and grandchildren. That's why the debate about climate change and net zero and energy is so passionate. But we mustn't destroy the futures of the young through the misguided policy of today.
What did he? Which did he mean there, Baker? Because I know Baker as well. I've met him and messaged him and stuff. Good guy, seems like it. But did he mean through not caring enough about the environment, or through stupid economic and energy
policies? Because he actually works. So he's retweeted one of my clips where I was saying that wind turbines are rubbish before, when I was talking to Nick Dubois, former Tory MP, who quit after putting the stabbing laws through. And also he works with Net Zero Watch, which I've written for before, which are by the name, they're very sceptical of net zero policies being too costly. Steve Baker's obviously right about this because, and these will be links in the description, they're not necessarily up on the screen. But if you look at like William Nordhaus, for example, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, he did a summary of the UN's climate policies and how cost effective they would be, similar to how Bjorn Lomborg looked at each of the UN's goals and said, right, climate change is second to last on cost effectiveness. Nordhaus said, if the UN tried to meet the IPCC's recommendation of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, they'd miss the target by 1.33 degrees Celsius with their policies, and they would actually save 14 billion by taking zero action against climate change rather than doing all their policies. So we're actively immiserating us. So it comes back to your question again, Nick. Is this deliberate sabotage, or is this just incompetence? If they're still pressing ahead with these policies, despite some of the smartest economists saying, hold on a minute, is it purposefully engineered collapse? So the sudden bout of this net zero skepticism has caused a bit of electoral, I suppose, astuteness among the Conservative leadership candidates race. And if we go to the next one, Lord Frost, the former Brexit minister, who's one of the few politicians that's actually half decent and isn't actually an MP, which is a shame, is called for a pragmatic response to climate change. And he said that we should ditch medieval wind power and go all in on nuclear and fracking. And I wholeheartedly agree. He says, just one of the many problems facing the UK is the net zero policy's cost. He blasted an approach that asked the public to end up the whole way our societies work. Lord Frost despaired about how many Britons are told by climate activists to stop travelling, live local, eat less, stop eating meat, turn our lights out, and generally stop being a burden. We've all gotten gradually used to this behavioural nudge, and indeed internalised it so that it seems normal to be lectured about the moral aspects of virtually every choice in our everyday lives. And at the bottom of this article you see Ben Goldsmith whining, who's the brother of the very wealthy Zach Goldsmith as well, who ran for London Mayor. Both Ben and Zach said they sympathised with the Extinction Rebellion, and Ben Goldsmith, I believe he still is the head of the Conservative Environment Network, but lost lots of donors when he put out a tweet saying Extinction Rebellion anchoring themselves to oil tankers were doing the right thing. That's right, I'm a Conservative.
It's funny how Lord Frost had to resign, to start telling the truth. He resigned, now he's the kind of conscience of the Conservative Party. He's kind of like Obi-Wan just floating up there.
He's like the Burkean id, yeah. I remember his article in The Spectator basically saying to Boris, you've made a mess of Brexit just because you didn't listen to me. And it's frustrating that he was not the ear, and unfortunately Carrie Antoinette was. And we're definitely still seeing Carrie's green obsession filter through to this, but it goes far deeper than Carrie, as you've already said. This is the WEF project, and they're ideologically captured, unfortunately. Now, it does seem that the animal is scared. With this next article in the Times, it's just golden. Now Brexiteers are taking aim at net zero, and God, we can only hope. So Truss and Sunak have pledged to reach net zero by 2050, but listening to Truss in particular, it is difficult to escape the impression that tackling climate change is to be sidelined, framed as a luxury can't afford in the heating versus eating era. And, I mean, you've engineered the heating versus eating crisis. This is a burden of your own making. So, yeah, we literally can't afford it. It's a terrible idea. Our field shouldn't be full of solar panels, she fumes. The green levy is to be ditched. She'll look for better ways to deliver our net zero targets. Boof! The sound of an issue being kicked into the long grass. How is saying that we shouldn't immiserate ourselves at the altar of the sun god avoiding an issue? Is utterly stupid. Farage and co. have set net zero in their sights. Thanks, Nigel. Earlier this year, he launched Vote Power, Not Poverty, a campaign demanding a referendum on the life-changing net zero plans forced upon us by Westminster politicians. In Farage's words, the rich landowners, wealthy investors, and foreign-owned conglomerates will benefit from green subsidies. And this is entirely objectively true. It's the Chinese who are manufacturing solar panels and batteries who are going to make absolute bank off of us. And then when we have a massive blackout because of renewables, we're going to go back cap in hand to Russia and the rest of the BRICS nations who are actually still developing oil and whose currencies aren't imploding right now despite the sanctions. Yes, all the old elite boogeymen are being dusted off and the battle lines drawn for yet another culture war. These forces have a clear us v them message. The best political campaigner in the UK, deep wells of oil and gas money, and helpfully irritating opponents from the celebrities who preach about the climate threat while continuing to take private jets to the activists who superglue themselves to motorways. The fusion of populism and Euroscepticism snowballed into a mighty political force. Now watch the fusion of populism and climate skepticism fast gain in power, especially as the profitable recession bites. Prime Minister Truss or Sunak may be tempted to make concessions to placate the new populist, climate skeptic beast. And it sounds like, I don't know if you've seen Starship Troopers by any chance.
I have, yes.
So you know the bug at the end
Saw it
where
at
he
the
goes,
cinema
it's
before you were born.
afraid.
Yeah.
That's this. That's the petrified bug knowing it's losing.
Yeah, I also hope, I haven't watched Farage's show for a while. I'm hoping he really does take hold of this because he always loves a referendum.
Yeah.
He likes to retire, then find another cause or referendum. So he said, let's do one on net zero. But then I haven't heard him talk about it as much lately. So I'm hoping it really captures the imagination because it's a bit different to Brexit, isn't it? It's a bit more complex in a way.
The event got put on hold because I believe the venue got shut down for threats. But I know Dominique, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Richard Tice, leader of the Reform Party, and Farage are all set to speak at it. And then so I don't know how the Power Not Poverty campaign is going at the moment, but I do know we need some net zero skepticism both in the halls of Parliament and in the public sphere to say, hey, this is the next civil rights frontier. This is a Trojan horse for you debilitating our way of life and making us into techno serfs. Please don't do this. Now, we have that opinion. Unfortunately, there is someone riding in on a white horse to try and save us from our stupidity. A centre-right climate party, centre-right, sure, has launched to oust Tory MPs opposing climate action. A new political party committed to solving the climate crisis plans to challenge the Tories in more than 100 seats at the next election. Ed Gemmell, a former army officer and city lawyer, registered the climate party with the Electoral Commission on Britain's hottest day last week. We've got one election left to save the planet, he said. Gemmell said his party would also target the 19 Tory MPs who are members of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. That includes Steve Baker, who he lost against quite a while ago. A collection of Conservative backbenchers who oppose the government's net zero policies. The Craig McKinleys, the Bakers, will stand up against them in every single place. Any Conservative that tries to join that group and destroy the future of my kids and lose us the big opportunity, we will put a centre-right candidate against them. Yes, you sound very Conservative. So then he wrote an op-ed for The Guardian.
This guy's unhinged. He said, we've got one election left to save the planet. That's unhinged stuff. It should be called the Apocalypse Party.
Yeah.
It's worse than the when Chuka Ramuna and Anna Soubry, that Change UK thing that lasted party. 10 months.
Yeah. Well, this is just about as reliable as the Mayan calendar. So he's done an article in The Guardian. Conservative members, and by default the whole country, have been let down by the current leadership race. Both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have almost completely ignored the climate and biodiversity crisis in their pitches to party members, effectively jeopardising the future of millions. Leadership has been lacking on the issue. So my co-founders and I felt compelled to create a new, strong, single-issue, centre-right party to champion these concerns, the Climate Party. And then he goes on to say, this is like sensible for business because we can get so much investment despite the costs that I've already outlined. No longer will it be necessary for climate-conscious Conservative voters to feel disenfranchised. The Climate Party is here to represent them. So as always, I thought I'd end with a lovely bit of eco-hypocrisy. Because it doesn't seem like he's going off to a great start. A flying start, you might say. Because as Guido Fawkes have reported, about 3 days before registering his party, he decided to sell his sports car on Facebook Marketplace. So if you can just scroll down, John. So he's not only called to limit population growth, like the genocidal maniac that he is, and his fundraiser made £0 out of the £770 that he tried to do to prevent the climate crisis. And he also failed as a council election in Buckinghamshire, where he lost to Steve Baker. But he tried selling his gas-guzzling Vauxhall Opet Speedster 3 days before launching the party, and he actually tried to reduce the price again to try and accelerate how quickly he could sell it off, because he realised the terrible optics of this. It's like when the Extinction Rebellion woman drove a diesel car and admitted it live on air on Talk.
Yeah, or Gary Lineker with his gas guzzling car always telling us off about various climate-related nonsense.
I'm sick of the private jet class telling us exactly what to do. So all we can hope with this is that the economic realities of terrible environmental policy are going to provide enough electoral motivation for whichever clown ascends to the Conservative leadership office position and eventually becomes our new Prime Minister. It encourages them to rescind some of these terrible, immiserating policies. We shouldn't listen to these misanthropic, doomsday-saying climate nuts. We can care about conservation, but pretty much all of the predictions of the past, overpopulation, global cooling, global warming, climate change, biodiversity crisis, etc., have not proven true. In fact, the biggest impediment to human flourishing is incompetent climate policy. And I suppose let's hope our politicians sit up and take note for once.
Thanks for watching this segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed, you can subscribe now and become a premium member on our website and gain access to our exclusive content, including the Epoch series where Bo and Carl and other guests talk about historical events, such as this one, A Bridge Too Far, talking about World War II. If you're interested in following us on social media and finding more, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com. Thank you and goodbye.